Hello friends, I welcome you all to our release planning webinar. I am Saket Bansal. I am an Agile trainer. I run a company named iZenBridge and we provide online and classroom Agile training, especially primarily focusing towards PMI-ACP training, and we do have an online PMI-ACP simulation test to make people ready for their final exam. In today's session, we will talk about release planning. Like while interacting with various participants or various candidates for PMI-ACP exam, I found that there is a bit amount of confusion for release planning, and this confusion primarily somehow also related with the fact that this is an event which is not described well in any of the Scrum guide, be it a Scrum guide which is written by the creator of the Scrums, and even the 11 reference book, the Scrum book which is referred by PMI, that Agile Project Management using Scrum, that book is also not talking about release planning. So that leave the candidates, the participants, wonder about what all is covered in release planning, when does it happen, who is responsible for it, because it's difficult to find a consolidated information related to release planning in any of the study material which we have. So I thought better to have a session on release planning, so we can talk about release planning based on various experience as well as the 11 reference book. I extracted information from those books because for exam point of view, the PMI is going to refer those books as a validator. So let's get into our session. During the session, I will take two logical Q&A breaks. So whenever you get a query, you just type it in your question box and I will take them during my Q&A breaks. So before we get into the planning, let us visualize the planning onion again. So the planning onion, whenever we talk about planning in Agile, we always make a statement that Agile teams are primarily focusing on 3 layers of the onion, which are day planning, iteration planning, and release planning. But the planning onion represents the overall planning structure which revolve around the Agile project. So Agile project is not only running iteration and doing daily scrums. It is beyond that. You have a release plan, you have a product roadmap, you have a portfolio, you have a strategy roadmap. But Agile teams are primarily focused on iteration and day. So the release planning, which is an outermost layer of the 3 levels where the Agile teams are concerned with, works as a bridge between the product portfolio planning and the day-to-day work which the Scrum team performs. So what is release planning? So if you talk about in a input-output format or a process format, release planning takes an input of team's velocity. It takes input as of a project length. It also takes an input of projectized product backlog, and on the basis of these 3 inputs, it produces a release plan which guides the Scrum team during their release time period. But don't we are we forgetting that in Agile we welcome change rather than following a plan? So if we know that everything is going to change, then why to do a release planning? Because release planning helps us in conveying expectation. It helps a business to communicate with the team what they are expecting after 6 months. It also helps teams to communicate back and explain what all is possible in 6 months. It serves as a guidepost. Think of a situation, if you don't have a release plan, then you don't have a release burn-down chart. So if you don't have a release burn-down chart, how are you going to manage scope creeps? How are you going to visualize the impact of changes which is happening in your iteration-wise iteration project scope, the impact of those changes on an overall release? So it serves as a guidepost, because by way of monitoring a release plan, we can control the scope creep. We can control the changes which are getting proposed in a release backlog. It also helps a product owner and team decide how much and how long, like how much work can be done and how long it will take. And yes, we are speculating. So release planning or a release plan is not a very deterministic plan. Things will change. It's just a plan. It's not a commitment. So there is a speculation. There is an uncertainty involved in a release plan. The stories which got picked in a release planning are going to change. The velocity which we estimated during release planning may get corrected while executing. But even if with these uncertainties, it still helps to achieve all these three purposes. It still helps to convey the expectation to the business as well as to the team. It still helps, it still provides a guide to the team while they are running iteration on iteration. So let's look back. How do we do it? So there are some preconditions for the release planning. The velocity should be determined. Or you can say these are the steps of release planning. So release planning is a collection of steps, and then you have a release planning meeting. So release planning meeting puts the tools and techniques and produces a release plan. So first you may need to identify your iteration length. On the basis of your team and iteration length, you need to estimate a velocity of your team. You need to identify what would be your project length, and you need to have a prioritized product backlog. Once you have these three, you apply tools like story mapping, prioritization, identify the minimum marketable features, identify the number of iterations needed. Okay, there was some audio disconnection. So identify the number of iterations needed to develop minimum marketable features. So once we apply these tools, once we apply this thought process, we produces a release plan. Now these are the steps. First, we determine the condition of satisfaction. Then we estimate the stories. Then we select an iteration length. These are not serial steps. They can happen in parallel or in iteration. So the selection of an iteration length also has a relationship with estimating the velocity, because iteration length and velocities are some way related with each other. And then we have a prioritized user stories. On the basis of velocity, on the basis of prioritized user stories, we just calculate the release date. Looks simple. So what is condition of satisfaction? Now condition of satisfaction is not like that the 100, if you have 10 number of stories that I want all these 10 stories get developed in 6 months. Rather than condition of satisfactions are more focused towards business goal. Right? Like in 3 months time, I want to launch a website which can give me a customer for online simulation test. So that is like a condition of satisfaction. Now the condition of satisfaction could be in the form of that by introducing this particular feature in my product, I want to reduce the operational cost by X%. Now these condition of satisfaction could be date driven, could be scope driven. So when the release plan is date driven, it is called time boxed. When the release plan is primarily driven by the scope, it is called scope boxed. But in Agile, you may wonder, can we have a scope boxed release plan? Yes, we can, especially if we are launching the product first time in the market. When we are launching it in the first time in a market, we may have some primary features which must be developed before the product can get introduced to the end user. Estimating the user stories. Now, estimation technique, we do have a planning poker, ideal days estimation techniques. Does the estimation done during the release planning meeting or before that? So there is a confusion in this because various teams adopting a practice where they are doing it before the release planning meeting and some teams are doing it during the release planning meeting. Now, before we produce the final release plan or before we take the final prioritization decision, we need to have estimated stories. It is recommended to have estimated stories before we get into the release planning meeting because the estimation itself takes a long time. Now, which all stories need to be estimated? Your product backlog may be having 100 stories. But in a release, you know that you are going to only take 30 or 40 stories. So you no need to estimate the complete product backlog. The stories which has a probability of getting selected in an upcoming release need to be estimated. But while doing a release planning meeting, you may identify new stories. You may split the existing stories. So there may be some disaggregation. So some level of estimation may happen during the release planning meeting as well. But it's better to have estimated stories before we get into the release planning meeting. Select an iteration length. Now, sometimes we think that iteration length is just a rule that we should have 30 days iteration or we should have 2 weeks iteration. So what to select in it? We already know that this is a recommended duration. Now, iteration length is also dependent on your length of the release. How? Say, for example, if you have a 3 months release duration and you also make an iteration of 30 days, then you only have 3 opportunities or rather say 2 opportunities to inspect and adapt. So it's better to have, as a rule of thumb, 4 to 5 minimal iterations in a one particular release. So if you are having a 3 months release cycle, then it's better to have a 2 week long iteration because the end of the iteration gives you an opportunity to inspect and adapt. You may do a mid iteration review, but only at the end of iteration you can know what all is done and what all is not done. Iteration length is also a function of amount of uncertainty, amount of variability is there in your project. If you have a highly uncertain project, you may want to follow a small iteration length. It also is a function of how long the priorities can remain unchanged. If you have a frequent change in a priorities, you may need to work with a smaller iterations. It also represents how willing you are to go without taking external feedbacks, because the product owner may be giving you a feedback day on a regular basis, but during a sprint review you also get an external feedback. And it also a function of overhead of iterations. So these are the factors which determines the iteration length. Now you also need an velocity for doing a release planning. How to define velocity, and this is a typical question which I get in all my trainings and all my sessions. How to estimate a velocity? If you have a good historical data, you can follow historical values. If you don't, then you can experiment. You can experiment for a while. If that is also not an option, then you need to forecast it. So forecasting and a velocity is a process where you may break down, you may do an engineering breakdown or a work breakdown of your given stories and do an ideal hour estimate and then reverse calculate the amount of work a team can do in a given iteration. But before we get into a release plan, we do need to have a number which helps us to project that how much we can deliver by the end of release duration. Now this number may change because release plans are not commitment. They are guideposts. So we need to have a number which helps us in starting the work. Now, before we get into the agenda and how part, till now we have covered why and what part of release planning. Let us take a Q&A break. So please type the queries and I would try to answer them. Okay, what are the minimum requirements which need to be set for a project release based on Agile methodology? So if you are talking about a requirement in the term of scope, so what is the minimum scope which a Agile project should deliver in a release? If this is a question, can you just confirm that is this the question? Yeah, okay. Now, if this is the question, like it depends upon condition of satisfaction. So we spoke about the condition of satisfaction is a goal, is a process which is first derived by the product owner, agreed by the stakeholders, and confirmed by the development team. Now, if you're producing, for example, if you're launching a job site, you have a condition of satisfaction or a minimum market condition of satisfaction that my job site should have a feature where it can take, it can receive profiles from the candidates and it can allow candidates to apply for the job and the recruiter should be able to post their job. So this becomes your minimum marketable feature. And in this case, condition of satisfaction would be, I need to have a job site which facilitate a job seeker to find a job. Now, depending upon your business, depending on your stage of the project, for example, if it's a first project, then you may have a minimum marketable feature as a first focus area for the release. But if the project is like if the release is incremental release, then you may have a different goals. For example, by this release, we want to make our product secure, or this release, we want to get into social media. We want to make our job site compliant with Facebook, Google+, Twitter, etc., etc. So the release goal derives the functionality which is needed in that particular release. Now, as you move forward, you discover a reality. So it's a speculation. You start with a goal in mind, but once you get into the project, you discover the reality, and that reality will help, like the release plans need to be updated frequently, especially at the beginning of next iteration. You should update the release plan on the basis of the data, the reality which you have discovered. Now, the deployment we are not discussing. Like I got a question where it is asking, what should I keep in mind before rolling out a release to a live site? So this particular presentation, we are talking about release planning. So that would be like a deployment focused Q&A, which we can take sometime later. Now, there is another question. Can the condition of satisfaction be considered as an acceptance criteria? In a way, yes. So usually we use the acceptance criteria, the term with the user stories, but yes, this is an acceptance criteria for the complete release. So it is not in the form of validation number, but it is in the form of business drivers. So for example, like if I want to launch a job site which facilitates user to apply for the job and facilitates recruiter to post the jobs, it may not have a 3 type of searches which I have visualized initially. But since it allows a person to search on the basis of keywords, I am still okay. So a condition of satisfaction is primarily driven by that I need to give an interface where people can interact and find the job. Now, as many features, then I prioritize the features, which is my must have, which is my could have, which is my should have, and that basis I move forward. Okay. Now there are few. Let me take one by one. If requirements are changing on a regular basis, how much this will impact the entire process? For example, 30% part confirmed as out of scope during cycle 3 or 4 for that specific iteration. See, if we talk about changes, it is very much dependent on the maturity of the team as well as the product owner. Now, in Agile, we welcome change till the time it helps business to grow faster, because Agile is all about adaptation. But we do take care of the risk of scope creep by making the release plan visible as an information radiator to all of our stakeholders. So if the stakeholders or product owners are playing with the release scope very frequently, your release burn down chart will reflect the reality iteration by iteration. And that is the reason I recommended that we should have nearby minimum 5 iterations in a release. So at the end of iteration, you would be clear that where are you heading towards, and that will your management tool to control the scopes. What do we do if release plan objectives have dependency on other release objectives? Now, dependency management, if you can clarify a bit, like dependency, for example, like you need to have external dependencies, and your goal of a release is, it's like somebody else is giving a part of it, but you are targeting to get this release a feature included in your product. Now, for that particular case, you need to include the assumptions, risk in your release plan. And as a normal project management practice, you need to keep track of dependencies. Okay, so another query. So it is okay to change and modify user stories to the release in between. See, that is where we talk about doing everything at the last responsible moment. The stories which get selected for release planning are not splitted till the time they have a schedule for a development. So yes, they can modify, they can get splitted into multiple stories, they can, and some part of those stories may become out of scope, because Agile is all about adaptation. So who all is present in release planning? Everyone. So stakeholders and the complete team, product owner, team, and the scrum master. And stakeholders are important part of release planning meeting. So we are getting good number of queries. Let me take few more. Okay, what is the role of Scrum Master in release planning meeting? By default, the Scrum Master is a facilitator. He needs to facilitate and adjust the release agenda, ensure that everybody is here, and lot of conflict happens during the release planning meeting. So it's not an easy meeting, because everybody is taking the product in their own direction. So the Scrum Master has to play a facilitation role. If the few things are not getting converged, he needs to park them for a while and help and note down the actions which require to be closed before we close the release planning meeting. So Scrum Master is a facilitator of the meeting, and product owner is a driver of the meeting, because product owner is the one who owns the release plan. Now, does the release risk plan considered as one of the artifact in Agile, as for instance continuous scope creep lead to a final release even though there is a customer buy-in? Now, in Agile, we talk about organic risk management. So till the time, especially for PMI-ACP exam point of view, till the time exam is not giving you a specific situation, we assume that team, which is a small Agile team, can handle the risk organically. So no special risk plan or risk output as coming out of Agile framework. But in practice, if you have a distributed team, if you have a Scrum, multiple Scrum teams, you may have a risk register and risk plan to substantiate your release planning. So for free tools, we will talk offline. There are a few open source tools, so we can take. Okay. Now, a final query before we move ahead. And a lot of things which we have discussed are also getting reiterated in our subsequent presentation. Is release planning meeting creates impact on financial side of the project as well? Yes. Now, in Agile, the budget is prepared on the basis of release plan. So if you have a the budget baseline comes from the release plan. So yes, the financial impact, the first level contract get made on the basis of release plan. So release plan does have a financial impact. Okay, let's move forward. And rest of the queries we will take at the end of presentation. Okay, so typical agenda. Typical agenda for the release plan. A release planning meeting. So visualize a release planning meeting of a day. Now there is another confusion. We don't have a prescriptive time boxed for release planning meeting. So there is no scrum rule talking about that release planning should be of X number of hours. So team should identify a time box for a given release planning meeting. So initially, before you get into the release planning meeting, you need to identify the time box. So if it's for a 3 month duration, a 1 day is sufficient. If it is more than that, then you may take 2 days. And if you want to estimate the stories during the release planning meeting, then you need to consider your time box accordingly. But there is no default rule given in any of the PMI reference book which you need to remember or visualize. No. Now we start with an opening where we talk about ground rules, the time box, the agenda. We set the stage, and then we talk about a product vision and roadmap. So this is a section where the sponsor, where the senior executive can present the vision and roadmap of the product. Like we had an opening session. After an opening, the senior executives or product owner representing the overall product vision and roadmap to the participant of the meeting. And then talking about condition of satisfaction. And then a team or a scrum master may present the planning data. They present the velocity, they present the information related to iteration length, they present the stories from the product owner presents the stories from the product backlog, which has an estimate. They may talk about issues and concerns. So whatever the issues and concerns which are visualized till that particular point may get highlighted before we get into the prioritization. So once we have this raw data, once we have the information of our roadmap in hand, then we work on prioritization of the story. So stories were prioritized before coming to the release planning meeting, but they get re-evaluated during the release planning meeting. For the prioritization, for visualization of the complete scope or a complete release product backlog, team may prepare a story map. So team may do a story mapping exercise to create a release plan. Once the story mapping is done, team may also prepare where they distribute the stories to the upcoming iterations. So by the velocity, by the iteration length, and by knowing the project duration, you already know how many iterations you want to run for this particular release. Once you have a prioritized stories, once you have a story map visualized, you start preparing the release plan. And in the release plan, we distribute the stories to the upcoming iterations. It's not necessary to distribute all the stories to the upcoming iterations. Say for example, if you want to have 5 iterations, it's not necessary to distribute the complete release backlog in the 5 iteration. We need to identify the stories which needs to be developed in, say, initial couple of iterations, say 1 or 2, and rest of the stories can be left that they will get developed in 3, 4, 5, 5th iteration. We need to document dependencies and assumptions, as some of you raised that how to handle the dependencies. So we need to document the dependency and assumptions, and then finally a product owner ideally product owner should present the final release plan to the stakeholders, because these exercises may happen in breakout sessions. It's not necessary that the complete team or the stakeholders are also involved while doing story mapping. So a team may do a breakout session, but ultimately the final release plan, because all these steps may iterate. You start with one level of prioritization, but you find that you cannot produce the complete set of priority in a given duration. Then you may end up splitting the stories. You may end up reprioritizing the stories. So once those exercises are done, then the product owner present the release plan to the final stakeholders. So this also may happen in iteration. They may raise a point, and then we again get into an iteration again. Ultimately, finally, when everybody agrees to the release plan, the meeting gets closed, and we do a small retrospective on the release planning meeting itself, because closing means retrospective. So we retrospect how was it, what we did good, what we can improve in a subsequent release plan. So this is the typical agenda. So this is how this is the how part of doing release planning, conducting release planning meeting. So you can visualize a meeting where these things are happening, and at the end you are getting a list of user stories which are mapped to the iterations. Now, a user story mapping, some of you might have seen it. It's a visualization of one dimension story or a release backlog into 2 dimensions. So we have a one axis, which is a horizontal axis, which talks about the business uses of the functionality, the sequence in which the business or an end user is going to use the functionality. For example, login. If I talk about job site, logging, creating a profile, publishing a job, and then applying for a job, and then searching the status, etc., etc. So that's like a business flow. So the horizontal axis will represent the business flow, the features which are needed as per the business, and the vertical axis talks about the stories. The vertical axis arranges the stories under those features. For example, for a search, I may have 10 categories of 10 types of search. For example, I may have advanced search, I may have a keyword search, I may have a search based on job location, etc., etc. So the vertical axis, we arrange the stories in the order of priority. So the top priority stories comes up, and in the horizontal axis, we arranges the features as per the business need, like the backbone feature. So the goal of creating a story map, user story mapping, is that we can identify which all stories we should develop in order to make the walking skeleton ready. So by working on some set of stories, we create a release 1, or we identify the stories which should be prioritized in iteration 1 or iteration 2. So user story mapping, which is usually performed during release planning meeting, is a tool which helps the team stakeholders visualize the complete functionality in 2 dimensions. And at the end of this, we get a release plan where we identify that these are the stories which will get developed in iteration 1, these are the stories which will get developed in iteration 2, and rest of them will get developed in 3, 4, 5. Why do we do it? Because in Agile, we do a planning at last responsible moment. It's not necessary to identify which story is getting developed in iteration number 5, because things will change. Things are going to change. So only plan the stories for the initial 2 iterations. The rest of the stories can remain as a bucket, as a packet, and they get scheduled in 3rd, 4th, or 5th iteration. The stories which are getting mapped to initial iteration should also sliced well. They should be invest story, means they should be small enough which can be developed. They should have a good amount of information attached to it, and once you start developing it, you should also have a acceptance criteria attached to it. But the stories which are getting developed at the later stage may remain at a epic or a higher level. So team doing in one of our classroom release planning meeting. And then we have a do's and don'ts. So release planning do's: identify story that will be worked on in the first couple of iteration. Don't identify the complete one. We spoke about it. You may like to document some assumptions and risk and issues. So some of you raised this query that what happened with the dependency, what happened with the risk. You may like to document the risk assumptions and issues, and the documentation of risk assumption issues are also dependent on the culture, the environment your company works in. If you are working in a customer or a vendor relationship, you may have a stringent process to document assumptions, risk, and issues. If you are working in in-house product, you may not have that much stringent process to document all this. Release planning, we need to balance anticipation with adaptation. We should not try to forecast the future at a very granular level, because we need to provide an anticipation, we need to provide a goal, but we should also remember that release plan is an adaptive plan. So we need to have a balancing between anticipation and adaptation. We need to think about business goals, project objectives, and customer expectations while doing release planning. We should provide necessary cost and schedule information to the management. One of the query came related to this, like we should have established priority for trade-off decisions. So while there was a question that what happened if the 30% of the scope gets changed, during the release planning, we should also talk about the trade-offs. We should talk about which one is the cost is more important or the time is more important, and which all features are essential. So the team, the group should identify what all elements are flexible and what all elements are non-negotiable. And in empirical process, if in agile, the new product development, we should not assume a situation where the time, cost, and scope, all three things becomes critical. That is something which is not possible for new product development. It's kind of impossible to deliver project on time, within budget, and complete scope, especially if it's a new product development. So we should have a trade-off which is talking about only one as a fixed element and rest of the element should be flexible. And it provides a baseline for analyzing events that occur during the project. So for example, the release plan may provide you the 300 story points. Now after baselining the release plan, you know how many story points has been added or deleted from the release plan. So net story point added, net story point represents the net scope change happened during the release cycle. Don'ts of release planning: do not assign developer to the user story or tasks. So in a release planning meeting, we should not think of allocating users, allocating people, that this is for you to develop in iteration 1, this is for you to develop in iteration 2. For that, we have a iteration meeting, iteration planning meeting or a sprint planning meeting. So don't do the work of iteration planning or sprint planning meeting in release planning meeting. Do not create a sequence or a critical path for iteration activities. So in a release planning meeting, we should not try to create a sequencing of the activities which we want to perform during an iteration. We should not discuss details of engineering task. We should limit to our discussion at the level of functionality. Some level of architectural or non-functional requirements need to be discussed. So say you should not discuss the engineering task, but requirement, be it functional, non-functional, can be discussed and should be discussed in release planning meeting. And we should not give an impression that this plan is fixed, because Agile is all about adaptation. Things will change. This is just a guiding number. And do not distribute the stories to all the iteration. It's better to do things at the last responsible moment. So let's discuss few of the queries which I can visualize that you might be asking. So I put them in a slide. When do we baseline budget for earned value monitoring? Now for earned value monitoring, like budget at completion, get baseline on the basis of release plan. So release plan gives you a budget and that becomes a monitoring tool for your rest of the iteration. Who maintain the release plan? Release plan is owned by the product owner. Product owner has a responsibility of maintaining the release plan. He is the only one who can add or remove stories from the release plan. In which phase do we conduct the release planning meeting? Now, if you talk about PMI-ACP or Agile Project Management Framework, where we have envision, speculation, exploration, adaptation, and closing phase, in those terms, we do a release planning during speculation. So you have yet to start exploration, but during the speculation phase, you create the first release plan. And in which phase do we conduct the release planning meeting? The same. So now in which iteration do we conduct the release planning meeting? So if it's a new product development, usually the release planning happens in iteration 0. If it's a subsequent release, then the release planning meeting can happen during the last iteration of the previous release. How do we calculate cost budget if we do not know the detailed requirement? And that's the frequently asked question to me, that if I have to quote the cost to the vendor or to the customer, this kind of planning can create a problem because there will be cost variance. Now, irrespective of the type of estimation you use, there always be a cone of uncertainties. If you are estimating anything during the initial phase of the project, those estimates will have a higher amount of variance than estimating at the later stage. So you will have a variance. Now, depending upon the expertise of your team in a given area, the variance could be high or low. So if you have done the similar projects, your variance would be low. If you have not done the project, your variance would be high. If you have done the project, your velocity data will also be a stable data because you do have a historical information for the same customer, same technology, etc. So irrespective of the methodology, you will have a variances, and this release plan is good enough to give you a first information about the cost which is going to occur in your project. Okay, so this is now, we are done with the presentation and bit about me and my company. So we provide PMI-ACP training, online classroom simulation test, and in a May we are targeting to provide classroom session in 4 of the major cities of India. And most of our webinars are uploaded at our YouTube channel. So it's a good idea to subscribe to our YouTube channel so you can stay connected with the various video upload we do. And let us discuss your queries. And these are my contact details. So you can reach me via mail. This is my LinkedIn profile, and you can reach me via phone as well. And I am like reachable. You can find me anywhere online. So it's not difficult to reach me. So let us take the Q&As break. Okay, so it's time for questions. Let me open the box. Okay, many. Okay, I need to sort them. Okay, is the condition of satisfaction as the same as the definition of work done? Now, is the condition of satisfaction is the same as the definition of work done? The definition of done, these are the few terms which we should keep separately. So definition of done is a technical term which we use for our work stories completion. So the story completion is get identified by the definition of done, not so what happens if your stakeholder is not available locally, that is a different location. So theoretically you should use technology, but if the technology uses by using the technology also you cannot have the interaction with your stakeholders, then you need to use electronic way like email process, but which is not recommended. So ideally it is recommended to have a video connectivity with your stakeholders, or you should have a proxy representation of your stakeholders. For example, your a set of your stakeholders are not available, but we should look for an option where some proxies can represent them, and then proxy takes a responsibility to sync himself or herself with the real stakeholders. So we should have the presence by one of these two ways. What are the key drivers for the release and sprint planning? So key drivers for the release is scope, money saving. So for the release planning, the key drivers are the goal of the release. What do you want to achieve? Do you want to launch a website for job seekers? Which is your target segment? There are already job sites for job seekers. There is a monster.com, there is a naukri.com. So why do you want to launch a job site for a job seekers? I want to launch a job site for college jobs, college students who are looking for a part-time jobs. So this is your released driver. You need to launch a job site which focuses on college students, and from there you start identifying how much time do you have, how much scope is required to have a job site which attracts the college students. So the golden rule of release planning is this, that we should focus on the business values, and all our prioritization decisions, all our scoping decisions should be driven by the business values. If the requirement specifications keeps on changing, then modification in test cases will result into how much this will affect the project estimation at the end. So this would be an observation. So, okay, in general, your velocity will talk about it. So in Agile, the monitoring framework is built around retrospective and visual indicators. So whatever happens in your project should get exposed very quickly to the stakeholders. If your iteration is not doing good, your iteration burn down should expose it the next day. If your release is not going good, your release burn down chart should expose the problem. And once you have this exposure, then you need to look to the root causes of it, and that we do during the retrospective meeting. So unlike our traditional development framework where we have thresholds defined, and whenever this project breaches that threshold, we need to take a corrective and preventive actions, in Agile, lot of things are dependent on the visual indicators and team taking adaptive actions to correct them. So that also answers your second question. So the best part of handling the efficiency of process is focuses on keeping your visual indicators current and taking a corrective and preventive actions, identify the corrective and preventive actions as a team during the retrospective meetings and implement them. And that is the solution for all your process problems. And we don't have any other solution. This is the only tool which we have in Agile framework to adapt, inspect and adapt. So we can take few more queries in case we have before I close this session. So if I summarize from especially from like in the focuses of PMI-ACP framework, release plan is like an outermost layer of the planning with which the Agile teams are concerned with. Release plan initially get prepared during the initial stage of the project, which is say iteration 0 or like speculation phase, and then it get adapted by the iterations. So at the end of iteration, before you start the next iteration, you should adapt your release plan. The cost baseline, schedule expectations get set using the release plan. So if you are monitoring your project using earned value, the budget at completion is getting calculated on the basis of your release plan. In Agile, we focus on welcoming change rather than following a plan. So release plan is also a flexible plan which can be changed to accommodate the business priorities. And if you have further queries, I will try to upload this particular presentation very soon to our YouTube channel. You can type, you can write the queries in the YouTube thread, and we will try to answer them there. And that's all from my side. And it was thank you very much for joining our webinar on release planning. Thank you.